My name's Brett Popwell. I'm a professor at the School of Journalism and Communication. Thank you for joining us on this panel to discuss the manager's perspective. What longer term implications do news managers see from journalism and pandemic coverage going forward? And how has journalism been changed by the pandemic? Those are the questions that we've been charged with discussing. With me today are Allison Uncles, Cheryl McKenzie, and Michael Melling. I will introduce each of our panelists briefly and then turn to them to give their opening remarks, after which we will proceed to a response period where each of you can feed off what each other has said. And following that, we'll go into an open Q&A. If any members of the audience would like to pose questions, please do so via the Q&A option and I will voice it to our panelists. I also have some prepared questions, which I have shared with our panelists prior to today's discussion. Our first panelist is Allison Uncles, the editor-in-chief of Maclean's magazine. Allison joined Maclean's in 2014 after 11 years as associate editor of the Toronto Star and 5 years with the National Post, where she served in a number of editorial roles, including national editor, associate editor, and managing editor. A graduate of the University of Cambridge and of Queen's University, she joins us from Toronto. Following Allison, we'll hear from Cheryl McKenzie, who is the executive director of APTN National News and Current Affairs. Cheryl has been with the Aboriginal People's Television Network since shortly after its inception in 2001. Working first as a reporter correspondent, she spent a decade as an on-air host and producer of several of APTN's marquee shows. Prior to her career in journalism, Cheryl pursued a career as a chef. She is a graduate of the University of Winnipeg and joins us from Winnipeg. And our final panelist today is Michael Melling, general manager of CP24 and CTV News Toronto. Prior to taking on that role, he worked as regional general manager for radio and local TV and as a regional news director. Michael has been with CTV since 2003 when he joined as a lineup editor and writer. Graduate of Queen's University, Michael has an MBA from Wilfrid Laurier University and an MA in international journalism from Cardiff University. And Michael, you joined us from Toronto as well, I believe. So I'm going to throw first to Allison for your opening comments on the issues at hand.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel today. It's going to be lots of fun, I think. I was thinking back to anything even remotely similar that I might have covered in my long and kind of old age career. And I think it goes without saying that none of us have come close to this. We weren't alive during World War II. Most of us haven't even reported from a war zone. The closest I came was 9/11. I was a news editor at the time, and I remember as the day progressed that the story seemed impossibly big. And one particular string of news alerts was really crushing. And I remember it so well, watching as the number of firefighters dead increased kind of hourly. At first, we had news alerts about firefighters going to the scene from this precinct and that precinct. And then when the first tower came down, those firefighters were dead. And hundreds of them, the first news alert said. And I remember sitting at my desk with my head in my hands, just unbelieving of that. How could that number be true? It seemed so huge. And I just, in preparation for this panel, I checked the number and it actually ended up being 343 firefighters on that day lost their lives. That number at the time was just overwhelming and unprecedented to me in my lifetime. And of course, we know later on that 3,000 people died in the towers. And we know that more than 9,000 have died in Canada of this pandemic. So the newsroom where I was working, the National Post at the time, was really young and a bunch of upstarts. We had no idea what we were doing, and we certainly didn't know what we were doing on 9/11. And we failed pretty spectacularly, I think, on that day. The front page we put together was really busy, a lot of stories, because we were overwhelmed with the implications of what 9/11 meant. That the economic recession that was about to come, and the personal stories, and would the US retaliate? So it was a very busy front. And in hindsight, it was one of the least effective fronts really produced in the entire world, because of course what you needed to do was run a big picture with maybe a word or one quote and just pause for a moment as a newspaper to acknowledge the enormity. So that's the kind of lesson that I drew, I think, journalistically from 9/11 was when a big thing happens, and that could even be an election, medium-sized thing, that I try to look for one thing that we can do that will have impact. Because the truth is that we all throw everything that we've got at the big story, and we all come out of it with a long list of stories that we've done that we're proud of. And we all try to rise to the moment. But in the end, kind of just like the failed front of 9/11, I feel you need to point to one thing that you're proud of. I feel that for me anyway, and the organization I'm with. I'll be interested to hear what others think. So something that kind of distinguishes you from others on a story, but also something that your newsroom will be remembered for. And usually that's something really hard, and usually that's something super ambitious. So for me, that came quite early on in this pandemic with a project called They Were Loved, which is an attempt to document and write obituaries about every single person who died during the pandemic. Its roots lay in a podcast from the New York Times, the Daily Podcast, which early on in February, they had their health reporter on, and he said, everybody will know somebody who dies. And we were sitting in a news meeting when our managing editor, Charlie Gillis, mentioned this podcast, and we thought, that can't be true. Everybody will know somebody who dies. That's just too enormous. And in March, my friend texted me to say that her sister had died very, very quickly and surprisingly from COVID. And so that was my moment, my personal moment of understanding everybody may well know somebody who died. So the next day I emailed Chris Waddell at Carleton, and he talked with the group of journalism schools about participating in a possible project where students would write obituaries over the course of years. And so far, 14 schools have signed up and are participating. We have a seed donation from the Geister Foundation, which has enabled the hiring of a fellow through Brett, who's our moderator today, and the Future of Journalism Initiative at Carleton. So we're so grateful for that support, and for Chris Waddell really taking the lead on this project. And so we're hoping over the course of years to write as many obituaries as is possible about people who've died in Canada. So that's where I feel that we've done well so far in our coverage of the pandemic. Of course, there are areas where we've fallen down. And one big one I would say is that early on, it was really difficult to figure out how much deference to give to the federal government. They had a ton on their plate, important life-saving work, and the smaller daily criticisms that we usually throw their way just seemed wrong. So every day Trudeau would give his briefing at the front of Rideau Cottage, and our small Maclean's team would transcribe it. We'd split up the minutes and we'd transcribe it and post it. We did that as a public service in part, but also it was driving a lot of traffic because people were keen to hear his reassurance, but also he was announcing policy, making policy announcements from his front porch, and people were wanting to read about it, CERB in particular. But those front porch announcements morphed into a kind of self-congratulatory, self-serving thing. And we didn't stop our transcriptions soon enough. We didn't realize what was happening soon enough. So that's something that I really regret, and that's a balance that I think is really difficult to strike in a moment like this, where you're trying to give the government slightly more deference than you would usually, but where does that end and where does the usual job begin? I also think that at Maclean's and media in general probably have failed to find the right balance in critiquing our public health officials. Maclean's deputy editor, Colin Campbell, mentioned this to me just before the panel about so many conversations we've had on the extent to which we should be towing the party line on public health. So we were so fearful of writing things that would make this pandemic worse that I think the result has been a kind of over deference to those public health officials, particularly on advice like wearing masks at the beginning, which in hindsight was awful and should have been, we should have been less forgiving of them in that moment. So that's my kind of self-flagellation, the areas where I think we've done well and the areas where we've been challenged and haven't done so well. But I'll be really eager to hear what others think of our performance and their own as well. So that's me, Brett.
Thank you so much for that. Cheryl, I have you in the lineup for next, and then after all three of you have gone, we'll go back over for any comments on each other's comments.
Yeah, no, that was very interesting. I was really glad to hear all of that, Alison. Thank you very much for sharing so much. For me, working in a national television broadcaster primarily, of course, we're multi-platform digital on our webpage and social media. We have a daily news program and a weekend edition. We do three current affairs shows every week, Face to Face, In Focus, which is a live 1 hour, Nation to Nation, which is our political show. And of course we have our investigative unit that is running, and our season officially just started at the beginning of October. But going back to when the pandemic struck, of course, very new territory for everyone, especially me in my job. I had only been on the job for in my executive director role for 8 months when the pandemic hit. And right away, APTN, our CEO and our COO just made the commitment that we really wanted to avoid layoffs. That's seems to be always a big thing for APTN is trying to avoid those layoffs that would come with something like a global pandemic for sure. So how do we do that? And we have the luxury of having a really strong IT department, which really made it possible for the majority of us to be able to work from home. Of course, there is that core group that needs to be in our headquarters. They need to be in our bureaus. That's those cameramen, the editors, the technical people, the master control, the broadcast techs, our IT people, and a couple of our social media journalists that need to be physically at the bureau. But other than that, the majority of the people are working from home, and we have the luxury of getting laptops, and we have internet at home. And for people who don't have these luxuries, like the people who we're trying to report on, that's been the most particularly obstacle that we're getting around. But as far as like our workforce goes, we really had to start adapting the way that we really want to present our news. Of course, with our news reporters and our camera people, everyone has to go out in separate vehicles. In the bureau, anybody who's not working for news, they ought to be working from home, because we have people in programming, in marketing, in other departments of APTN. So our CEO set out that directive that news is an essential service, and the operations and IT need to be working toward first making sure that our signal stays up for the broadcast and our digital infrastructure, but also needs to make sure that the news department is equipped to stay producing stories. So I had to make all these different scenarios where, if we lost this person, or if we lost this studio, what would we do? We made a new makeshift control room in our basement, and in case we had to all of a sudden, close down our main control room and have it disinfected and cleaned up, just to make sure that we could definitely stay on the air. So it was like the leadership higher up above me that made it possible for us to have this environment to keep doing our work and providing that essential service of news. And I don't know how others felt, but for as far as the attitudes for working from home, that wasn't always something that was encouraged. There was the perception that the person's not going to be delivering as much if they're working from home. However, we found out that, everyone in our newsroom, just took to it like fish in water. Like I keep using that expression because our content we thought, was going to go way down, and we'll have to resort to, a lot of talking heads on the news, which to some extent we still do, of course, because we have to rely on this means of communication. But there still was that creativity there, and there still was that going for the accountability stories in addition to the COVID. And so once we realized that our newscasts are really about, COVID this and COVID that, and this is so depressing, and meanwhile, even before COVID, there was a lot of other like really pressing subjects that were really serious. And we try not to dwell on, we don't want people leaving our newscast and thinking, oh man, we're in really bad shape, have to provide that balance. So that's in our reporting about COVID, we're trying to look for those stories also. So it's not just COVID, and started tapping into more people about how they were dealing with the pandemic, and talking with these elders. They talked about going through the Spanish flu, and how people survived, 100 years ago, kind of thing, and like whole families taking off and going out onto the land, and staying there for months at a time, and being happy doing that. So a part of it was really super interesting, just to see more of that cultural connections that are being made, and the cultural survival and the resilience that's happening, and thinking about their ancestors and how they've lived through previous pandemics and still come through it, and really trying to protect their communities and protect their elders, and knowing that looming threat exists just because of the living situations in a lot of the communities. So at APTN, I think we've really been lucky that we have a really strong infrastructure to support us in the newsroom to keep doing our jobs, and a CEO that believes in news as an essential service. So so far so good.
Thank you for that. Michael, I'll throw it to you.
First, thanks for the invitation. Happy to be here and happy to take part in the panel. Cheryl, Allison, great to meet both of you. I think I'm going to build on a lot of what you guys have just said. In terms of the experience in the newsrooms that I work in at CP24 and CTV News Toronto, the last 8 months have been a blur. It feels like it's just flown right past, and we keep counting the number of months it's been, but it doesn't feel like it's actually been that long. Time has just flown. And it's almost been surreal. I don't think many of us imagined we'd be dealing with a situation like this. But we are. And I think when I reflect back on it, I think it almost feels like it crept up on us and we didn't notice it coming. We heard about the coronavirus, COVID-19. I remember sitting in the car with my wife looking at video of that hospital they were building in China with all the cranes, and they were trying to build a hospital in 7 days, and saying to her with our kids in the back, look what's happening. Like, this is happening over there. Isn't this amazing? what is going on. And within a matter of weeks, that NBA game was canceled in the middle of the game. And for me, that was oh, this is real and this is happening. And in the back of my mind, I always had, what are we going to do if and when this actually does hit a certain level of scale? But when that game got canceled, of all things, that was the one that really sparked it for me to say, okay, now it's time to implement some action plans. And things are going to be very different for who knows how long. And I think the how long is the thing. When it first started in Ontario, they extended March break for 2 weeks. And we thought, oh, it'll be 3 weeks. We're going to have to figure this one out. And the kids will all go back to school. And then after about 2 weeks, you went, no, this isn't happening. And it just kept extending. And I think we've all come to the acceptance now that this is our reality for the foreseeable future, more than likely for the next year, until there's a vaccine. And when I reflect on what this meant for our teams, I think I put it into 3 buckets. One is the journalistic, one is the operational, and one is the emotional. So as a leader working through it, I sort of compartmentalized it into those 3 parts. The journalistic, this is one of the biggest stories of our lifetime, but this is what we do. We run towards the story. We've got a great team of journalists and technical support, control room support, digital, you name it, a wonderful team of people. And this is why they're in the game, is to tell these important stories that are important for people. So while there was obviously stress of covering a major story, it's not that far out of our comfort zone. The second part, though, the operational, was where we started to feel some stress. At the 2 newsrooms that I run, we had to make some pretty quick decisions in terms of how we were going to sustain the business and protect it, with a lot of unknowns. The virus was new. We didn't know all the details of how it spread. Allison, as you alluded earlier about the health and safety protocols with masks, there were a lot of questions and unknowns, and we had to make some decisions with incomplete information. What we did here was we separated our teams into inside and outside, and we opened a remote facility for some of our newsroom teams to work out of. Folks, as Cheryl was saying, they weren't traveling in the same vehicles together. We put microphones on the end of hockey sticks, all the stuff that I'm sure you've heard of before, and implemented some work from home procedures. It took us a good between 3 to 10 days to get all that up and running. Then the third part of it, which was absolutely the most difficult, was the emotional. I think as leaders and as a team, you're used to working together and solving problems. But when something like this hits, it's the first time I've worked with a group of people where there's an emotional sense in the room and one of fear for themselves, for their own personal safety, for that of their friends and their colleagues, and the unknown. There's a natural anxiety around it. And people don't always respond when they're in an anxious state. They often react. And I think for us as a team, that was the biggest challenge, was managing some of the reactions, a lot of the questions. And for all of us who work in newsrooms, we know they're full of people who ask questions and keep asking questions until they get an answer that they're satisfied with. And sometimes when you're managing a situation like this, you just don't have the answer, right? The answer is we're trying our best, or we're going to have to go back to somebody and get the answer for you. But I think for me and the managers I work with, managing the emotions of this pandemic has probably been the biggest challenge we've had. So when I reflect beyond that, in terms of the 4 biggest takeaways for me, I thought about it and I categorized it into 4 different parts. The first one I'd say is the importance of knowledge. In this particular area, it would be of science and health-based issues. We really, needed to have somebody with a strong functional understanding of health and science, who was comfortable keeping on top of the file, understanding where things were going, so that we could ask the right questions. And as Allison said earlier, be comfortable pushing back or asking questions from an alternative viewpoint. I think we did our best with it, but for me, it's a takeaway that going forward on big stories, you need to make sure you've got a functional expert or someone not necessarily in-house who's ready to go beforehand, but when something like this hits, they've got to be handed the file and you own it, and you've got to be on point with all the topics. The second point, though, and this follows up on Allison's earlier comment about perhaps an over-deference, is the ability to balance points of view and fairness with science and our duty to public safety. I think it is ingrained in us to present the different angles of all the different stories. But through the pandemic, there were times when there were feelings and conversations within the newsroom about this is the direction we're being given by the experts, and we need to sort of temper alternative views. In hindsight, if you look at what Allison mentioned about the mask, that's a great example, right? Originally, we were told no masks. Now we're all being told masks. Well, maybe we could have asked some more questions about that at the beginning. On the other side, if you look at it now with the anti-maskers, we need to balance how much airtime we give them, right? And make sure we're balancing their point of view with some science as well. The third point that stuck out for me, and Cheryl raised this as well, is that I'd say it's the renaissance of public service journalism, and a reminder that we are essential workers and that we're providing a public service. Canadians turned out to our organizations in droves, news organizations across the country, their audiences spiked. And it's a reminder that we are truly providing value for the audiences. While other areas of media saw drops in their audiences, news maintained or went up. And it is a resilient area of content that people want to consume. And I think this was a good reminder of that. And it's also a reminder, a lot of us, we're privately funded organizations, but at the end of the day, we're providing a public good. And I think that's forgotten. People often look to their governments or NGOs to provide public goods. But even though we're privately funded, we are truly providing a public good with the journalism that we provide. And then finally, the last takeaway on my end, and Cheryl, you alluded to it earlier, was almost a forced acceptance of new ways of working. The working from home, using smartphones for double enders, sitting at a conference like we are today, not needing to travel. You can get the interview instantly, whether it's having to travel to the other side of town to do an interview or travel around the country. I think the audience has accepted what it looks like on TV. Shooting an interview on an iPhone, and it does make our jobs easier. I'll admit, as somebody who makes television, it is nice to have a nicely shot interview, but sometimes all the audience wants is something practical, and they want the information. So I think it has forced us to accept these new ways of working, and it's proved that they do work very well.
Thank you for that. I might just start with there's a few things I picked up from each of you. And one that, Michael, you just got to it at the end there as well. And Cheryl, you brought it up, and you had me thinking about, and I've been thinking about this a lot, is how everyone's sort of operating without a newsroom. And every newsroom I've ever worked in is like this. I never quite understood why they were so open concept. It was just sort of something we all accepted. We were all sort of working on top of each other, or like, noise right here. If that disappears, I take it right now it has, what impact do you think that has on what it means to be a journalist or to be someone who's supposed to be working in those environments? What is actually lost when those physical spaces disappear?
I know I really miss that environment, and just being able to, just yell across a desk to the colleague and talking and joking around. But I guess for us, just the things that come up naturally in the conversation and then end up becoming like really critical conversations in your whole newsroom.
Yeah, I would massively agree. I'm sorry, am I mute? I can't mute, and I sometimes see you and sometimes don't. So I may be behaving in a very odd way. I'm sorry to just jump in if this is not my turn. But yeah, we've really missed the fun, laughing, joking meetings where we feed off each other's ideas, because sometimes someone will come to a meeting with not a super well-formed idea, but a grain of an idea, and in going around the table and building on it and everybody adding their expertise to it, it ends up being an amazing idea. And that happens sometimes for us in these video calls, but far less frequently than it used to. So our meetings aren't as fun. So I'm really miss that. But I would also say we're probably not coming up with the quality of ideas that we used to, because there's a little bit of magic dust involved in being together and developing an idea. And we haven't managed to figure that out on video yet. Some days we come close, but it's never quite as good.
I would agree. There is a magic to that face-to-face human interaction that just can't be repeated on the phone or through email or through a video chat like this. And when you're trying to hash out an editorial decision, if the Zoom is freezing up and you give up on the Zoom and hop on a conference call and you've got 6 people talking over one another, you can't get those physical cues of who has something to say. It does make communication more difficult. That said, it is what it is. And we just have to deal with it. And I think we're doing our best. The other side of it, though, is I do find we've been doing every quarter, every 3 months, staff meetings for the overall teams. And our teams are on the road in different parts of the city. They're all out and about. And to try to coordinate those face-to-face historically has been a nightmare. You're looking at everyone's shifts and schedules and where they are and trying to get them back to the station so you could get people in a room. And instead, what we've been doing is having 3 or 4 Zoom calls at a certain time, pick 3 different appointments, and people can just hop on for an hour and we can have a check-in as a team. And that's actually been a good thing, because before we never would have thought to do that. We would have basically had once a year, everyone gets together and we coordinate a large team meeting. Whereas now we're not afraid to say, you know what, let's just do 3 Zoom calls over the course of the week. People just hop on when they can and we can chat. This is the week we're doing them at CP24. One of the calls was 15 minutes and 7 people showed up. The other call was 50 minutes and 27 people showed up. And we've got another one on Friday, and the rest of the team might show up. So there's pros and cons to it.
I would say as well, it's hard to kind of be on top of how picking up the cues of how people are feeling. And given that we're probably busier than we have ever been, I find making time or making sure that I touch base with people just to have a chat rather than a really focused meeting. I fall down on that all over the place, and that's probably more necessary now than it was in the office, where I could just see that somebody was a bit down that day and just check in with them. Now it has to be an appointment. And
Sorry, wait a second.
Sorry.
Sorry, just Cheryl she had to take a call.
Okay. yeah, just to make yourself, as a busy manager, check in with people in a way that's just feels a bit forced, whereas it was just so natural in an office setting. I do miss that part too, feeling that I had a better sense of how everybody was feeling.
On that, and to the notion of to what you were saying, Allison, about perhaps early on in the coverage, there was a bit too much deference being paid to the politicians and to the public health officials. It struck me that so much of sort of the direction that a publication or a broadcast will go comes from the top, right? It's like the reporters tell you what they see, but if they need to know when to push harder, and go further and maybe ask, be more questioning. I'm curious, like if that puts a lot of pressure onto the managers then to sort of make those kind of calls at a moment when you don't have the support of the newsroom actually being present around you, and if that perhaps sort of played into this deference, and what and how, whether or not now, as we're in the second wave and moving forward, if this is something that you're like, how you are changing your approach now versus back in the spring.
Well, yeah, it's lonely. It's usually lonely, but it's more lonely now because you kind of sit here in the basement cell trying to make decisions. I have wondered about whether editors and reporters, because we're at home with our families and our work life is so intertwined now with our home life, if that is having an impact on our decision making and how we treat stories. It just so happens that the last little while, we McLean's have done some really gentle, lovely stories. And I wonder, I don't know if we were at work every day, being the way that we were at work together, if we would be thinking of some slightly harder edge stories, because we've managed to extricate ourselves from day-to-day life, and we've put our reporter or editor hat on, and we're that person, and now we're this one person. That might seem pretty existential and weird, but I have been wondering if embedding ourselves like this, like as we are in our day-to-day life, is impacting our judgment at all. I'm not sure if that gets at the answer to your question, but it's definitely something I've been wondering.
I think it does. I wanted to let everyone know. So we heard from Dr. Teresa Tam today, and others talk a lot about fatigue, and we talked about this a little bit here in the comments that have been made, in using other terms. But Dr. Tam spoke of public fatigue. Jamie Poisson from Front Burner spoke about reporters' fatigue. I want to ask each of you about your own fatigue and newsroom fatigue in general. How fatigued are our media operations, and does that impact the journalism being produced?
I don't know who wants to go first.
I'm happy to go first. I feel that the newsroom to me feels energized in a way that we more than ever understand the importance of journalism, and you get a lot of satisfaction from feeling that you're doing something important. But definitely the long hours of the first few months in our newsroom had to change. That couldn't be sustained, how we were working in March and April, and I guess probably much of May. So for this summer, we very determinedly scaled back on what we were producing online, which is a luxury that I wonder if a magazine has, and more news-driven broadcast organizations don't have as much, but we did pull back on purpose just to give people a breath before the second wave hit. So I would say that we're in okay shape, rest-wise and feeling energized, but only because we made ourselves take a breath there for a few months.
I'd say for us, there's definitely some people who the pandemic has probably affected them a lot more than others, depending on their situation. Like, I can really relate to people who have like parents who have kids in school. You know, that's a tremendously stressful situation for them early on, before when the schools were all closed down. And they're trying to still do their jobs from home while their kids are home, and you know their partners are at home, and they're trying to struggle. And you know, we all know those kinds of stories. But the where the pandemic hits people hard, I find it's been like kind of a roller coaster for a lot of people, like some, including myself too. You know, like some weeks are a lot easier than other, they seem to be a lot easier than other weeks, and go through that kind of cycle. And we have had a couple people who have needed to go on leave, not directly because of COVID sickness, but definitely because of how the pandemic has affected them. So that means we needed other people to cover off on their jobs. So they're doing more in order to get our content to air. Um, I've had the overtime for a lot of our staff is gone like way up, and now we're entering the territory where we're going to have to think about buying out some of this overtime, which would be a big strain on our budget, because we just can't give them the time off so that they can burn their overtime and the vacation time that they're earning. But we also recognize too that we have to give people the time off. So we do encourage people to take a day off here and there. So it does end up where we'll have more just interviews on our newscasts instead of the news story, having people going out there doing the news stories. So I guess it's been a real mix, and one week is different than the next, and we just don't know what's going to happen week to week. And I'm just very grateful that we have a great team to work with each and every day.
I'd say my experience has been similar. I think, is it a fair assessment to say that the team is tired or fatigued? Yes, but they are a great team of people, and they are professionals, and they will always rise to the occasion. I think each individual, their level of fatigue differs for different reasons. And Cheryl, you sort of alluded to some of that as well, right? If it's a personal situation, balancing the child care situations, a sick relative, you know, a family member who might have lost their job or fears losing their business. A lot of the fatigue comes from outside of the workplace. And then for some of our employees, it is from inside the workplace. Some of our you know, senior folks are carrying a heavier load. Some of our managers dealing with, you know, the logistics of managing health and safety and COVID on top of their day-to-day workload and the editorial definitely has its effects. I took a 5-week paternity leave this summer, and when I came back, I walked in and went, wow, you guys are tired. And it was helpful for me to step back from the organization for a couple of weeks for a family reason, and then come back in with a fresh perspective and go, wow, my guys are tired. And we were very deliberate, similar to Allison and Cheryl, ensuring that everyone took time and kept pushing them to take vacation time over the summer, and said, don't be afraid to pause or park things. They can wait until later. But coming back into the workforce after a few weeks away from the building, it was a reminder for me to work with my team to make sure that we're not pushing them when it's not necessary to push them because there's already enough on the plate.
Michael, I have a question that I'm going to put you on the burner plate here for the next second. We've heard a lot about how local news outlets have been hit particularly hard by the economic fallout from the pandemic. Ryerson's April Lindgren recently wrote an article in Policy Options headlined "Local News is being decimated during one of its most important moments." And in a panel earlier this afternoon, John Hondrick, former publisher of the Toronto Star, said, and I quote, "This has been quite a catastrophic hit." And he went on to describe the advertising declines that his former paper has received. But he also said something really interesting. And he said, on the subscription side, I can tell you the pandemic has been great for business. And then he went on to say, this is really a story in which local is the key. So one thing that struck me, just as you are the general manager of two of this country's biggest local news operations, hoping you can tell us what you make of the situation in local news from what you can see in Toronto and elsewhere, and whether or not that situation is different in the medium that you're in.
So I can tell you our audiences remain strong, and through the pandemic, CV24 had its best year ever in the last broadcast year to date. So it tells you the importance of local. People want local news. And CTV Toronto as well has had tremendous performance through the pandemic. So it's clear that local is important to people. But I think it's important to remember, though, that the economic pain being felt by newsrooms across the country didn't start with the pandemic. This has been an issue that's been going on for a long time. We've been talking about it for years, probably a decade and a half, and the pandemic has made it worse and just brought it to a boiling point. Newsrooms are no different than most other businesses being affected by this pandemic. Think of a hairdresser, a restaurant, a car dealership. All of them have had a massive change in their businesses over the last couple of months. And frankly, some of those businesses will make it, and some of them will not. And that's just a matter of business. I think, I referenced earlier, what makes news different compared to those other businesses, though, is that it's a public good generally being provided by the private sector. And I think we often forget that. So while we talk about some businesses maybe not making it, there's a public value to what our news organizations are doing. And I think it's a shame that some of these organizations might not make it, because I think we need a diversity of voice in this country. I think competition is a good thing. I think it makes us stronger as a country and as a democracy. So I think the road forward has a couple of forks in it. One fork is a regulatory or a legal change that will do things like force digital media companies to compensate news organizations for the content that they are then promoting on their websites. And that will help ease the pain. And that's a conversation that's been taking place before the pandemic even started. The other is the free market will determine what happens, right? And some of these operators will close and others will pivot and adapt to new technologies and seek ways of controlling costs and finding other revenues, and they'll live or die by the free market. And we'll just have to see what happens.
Thank you for that. Cheryl, I wanted to follow that up with you, because you mentioned earlier the underlying sort of hope back in the spring was to avoid layoffs, right? So APTN is community focused, but also serves communities across the country. And I'm curious whether your team has experienced the pandemic differently from Michael's team in Toronto, and how you would describe your network's health at this time, and has that changed over the course of the pandemic?
Yeah, I guess depending on where in the country our journalists are. Um, I certainly don't envy your situation in Toronto, given the numbers and just how close and dense the population is. Because we have our, reporters in Halloween, Whitehorse, Yellowknife, where, they they're taking all the precautions for COVID, but we all see the numbers how low they are there, and we have a couple of reporters heading out to Dawson City and said, well, I guess you can travel in the same vehicle. We didn't not taking some of those same precautions. So definitely some of them don't have the same kind of stress that we do down here down south with the COVID fear of COVID infection for sure. Um, but as far as feeling any different, I don't think it's really an issue right now to be too different, other than the variables and the population and the density.
Allison, I had a follow-up for you. And my background is print, so I and I always sort of think of print as sort of two products at this point, right? You have the digital product and the printed product. But just focusing first on the concept of local. This has been quite a bit of emphasis on local at this conference, but that's not your emphasis at Maclean's. It's national, and so I was curious if that national general interest focus has shielded Maclean's from some of the quote unquote decimation at the local news level that we've heard others talk about here.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think the short answer would be yes. I think I take issue with this story being a local story. It can't be it can't be just one or the other. It is absolutely national as well, and that's where we kind of work and play. At Maclean's, we had a story early on by our freelancer Patricia Trouble that did incredibly well online, very national focus on the lack of national figures that would, being released by the federal government that would reveal whether we were flattening the curve or the curve was getting steeper, or really the curve at all. The federal government was not releasing those figures. So Patricia had pulled them together herself. And for a few weeks there, Patricia was the person doing that work, and the federal government finally started jumping in too. So I'm just stuck on that comment from a little bit ago about how this pandemic is a local story, because I think we've found lots of places where it has been a very, very national story. So I think that has gained a lot of traction. I would also maybe take issue a little bit with the idea of us being a news organization, because I think, those CP and CBC and Globe stories that are more up and down about an event, local or not, are vulnerable at the moment. But Maclean's tries to come at things tangentially. Very seldom would we do an up and down news story. We try to do an analysis. We try to do a bigger feature about it. We try to do an oral history, just play with it a little bit rather than the more commodified news that is suffering. But I guess the third thing I'd say about local versus national is we have tried here and there to make some inroads in local stories. We got very excited about the idea of data around the school closings or school reopening in September. And we pulled together a post again with Patricia on some local data from across the country, where outbreaks were happening, which schools were having to close and that kind of thing. And it was too big And people were searching, of course, for their local school or their city's situation. So we ended up backing off that post because there just we weren't finding traction with a more national look. People weren't interested in the national look. So that was a situation where local was really sought after and we couldn't deliver. But overall, national keeps playing well for Maclean's for sure.
The I do agree with you. The I was echoing John Hondrick on the local. I wake up every morning and I go global. I check to see what's happening in Europe and then assume that we're just 2 weeks behind, and then go national and then try and figure out where it is in my neighborhood. I did have a follow-up question for you, just to do with Newsstand, I suppose, and just with the concept that there is still a delivery mechanism to what you're doing, which is the printed product, which goes out to subscribers and also to these bricks and mortar stores that I don't actually know what is happening to them at this moment in time, and whether or not this impacts what your team would potentially be doing beyond the other side of this pandemic.
Yeah, that's been really interesting and slightly terrifying to watch how newsstand sales in particular have played out during the pandemic. At the very outset, we did really well on newsstand. We had a well-timed COVID cover that sold really well, and we tend to sell at Maclean's, tend to sell quite a lot in grocery stores and drugstores. So those were the stores that were open. And actually, we've seen double-digit increases of our newsstand sales in drugstores. So that's the good news. In the depth of the lockdown, though, we did see decline on newsstand, and we had to pull back copies that we would usually send. So we were sending far fewer out to stores because so many were just closed. So that there's a period there in the middle where the newsstand sales were really not good, pretty dire. They're jumping again, and we're hoping that we're going to finish the year on par with where we were this time last year. Some of our magazines within St. Joe's, Chatelaine and Today's Parent in particular, they send a few copies, a portion of their newsstand sales they send to doctor's offices and dentist offices. Maclean's doesn't do that almost at all anymore, but those two brands do, and they've pulled back during this time. And the circulation manager tells me that they'll start sending them again when they feel that it's safer. That part doesn't impact Maclean so much, but subscription wise, we've definitely seen an uptick in subscriptions, not a massive one, but we do get some feedback through our letters to the editor and a few readers who reach out here and there. There's a portion that are supporting us because of their support for Canadian journalism and also their extreme interest in the pandemic. But the uptick hasn't been massive. It's basically keeping us even with our decline in newsstand sales over the summer. Yeah, so that's where we stand paper wise. But paper, there's still surprisingly for I think a lot of us that it really endures. It's a very solid base of print subscribers. And I had some conversations recently with some magazine editors in the States who've launched paywalls lately, in particular the Atlantic, and they've really seen some great success in people adding on a print subscription when they sign up for their digital package. And we're at Maclean's launching a paywall next year, and we're hoping we'll see an uptick in print subscriptions then too. So that's the news from the circulation front, Brett.
I like the, just to go back to something that Michael, that you said about how there was this moment when you remember seeing the cranes building the hospital in China on TV, I guess, and that's when it sunk in. There was a moment when all of this was starting where I walked into a drugstore and I saw pandemic on the cover of Maclean's, and I realized Oh, I guess I need to start. It's coming. It's on the cover of, of Maclean's. It's here. We have a question that's come in from the audience, and it's as this is from Carlton. This is I suspect from a student and a prospective person who might work in any of your newsrooms in the future. Question is, what do you think the key skills will be for new journalists post-pandemic?
I think the skills post-pandemic, the skills will be similar to the ones we were starting to look for aggressively before the pandemic. On the television and broadcast side, it is multi-platform. The expectation now is you're not just a reporter, you're somebody who can shoot video, cut video, and front the video and do a live hit. And I think what the pandemic has proved to us is the viewers are good with unconventional sources of video interviews off of Skype and iPhone and Zoom. So proficiency using those kinds of technology to do your interviews, and also an acceptance that that's reality. I think where you might run into some challenges is thinking that that sort of system isn't good enough. And we shouldn't be using stuff like that, basically trying to fight the new technology. I think it's important to accept it and adapt to it and use it as a tool in your kit.
I think for us at APTN, yeah, definitely, Michael, absolutely. You know, those reporters that can do it all. And it's a tremendously tough job being a VJ and having to, we still use the big broadcast camera. We have smaller ones available, but we find the more experienced camera people really prefer those Sony XD 400s or whichever generation we're on now. The ability to have those skills to be able to front VJ, edit, write your story. But I think the biggest thing that I've seen where people have success is that being a good writer and being able to adapt your style for the different platforms, whereas that's where I find are the strongest journalists that we have.
It's interesting for me to hear you both on this question, because our we're so much less technologically based, I guess, at Maclean. So I'm really struggling. I'm so glad you both answered the question before I had to jump in. I'm struggling with anything that's changed, Maclean's wise, magazine writing wise, before and after the pandemic, because I think I'd still be looking for somebody who has a deep curiosity, ambition for a story, who's really passionate, who writes, who can really write with a capital W. And also, this was true before the pandemic, and I think it's still true. Maybe it's even more true that we don't like working with people who aren't nice. We're a small team and we have to all row in the same direction. And so being a good team player who's, a good part of a team and team spirited and happy to help other people and to celebrate their successes and cheer for them and want your colleagues to do well, and your colleagues will want you to do well. That's the kind of person who fits in our team anyway. But that's not different from what was true beforehand. It's possibly slightly more true because we're feel it's us against the world at the moment with so much work and such a massive story to tell. But those central tenets, I guess, of what we'd look for are unchanged.
Speaking of the central tenets of what you look for, has it changed on the stories at this point? Like if you, for the stories beyond the pandemic, is the bar higher or different? Are there certain things that you would have done pre-pandemic from sort of the stories that would be told that you think it's time to get back to, or realize that you have been omitting?
I could totally jump in on that because again, we fell down. I fell down at the beginning of the pandemic, I feel, because if you look through the first few editions after the pandemic was declared, basically our entire print edition was either COVID or racism in the summer, and sometimes both of those things. And they were very, very heavy editions and massive stories that need to be told, you know, at length and with lots of ambition, no question. But there was no room for anything else. And we have recently been asking ourselves as we look at the page laydowns, where is the joy here? Where's the, you know, the wonder? So we're really making ourselves try to look for those stories again, because we miss them personally, and also because a magazine isn't really a magazine if it's only ever about one thing always. But it's been, we have to be deliberate about it, because otherwise we will gravitate back to only writing about the two big stories happening in the country at the moment.
I'm not really sure we would look at changing anything editorially in terms of the story selection. I think we'll continue to follow the news and, you know, keep the customer first, the viewer first in terms of what we think is of interest to them. I think what it has reinforced, though, is an importance of sticking to our principles and our policies as a news organization and as journalists. I think through the pandemic and, you know, politically over the last couple of months, we have seen an increase in fake news with regards to stuff floating around with regards to the pandemic, health information. And I think it's very important for us to continue to remind ourselves of our principles and the importance of those principles for accuracy, fairness, trust, and balance, and stick to them. And, you know, for our journalists not to be giving their opinions, just to make sure we stick to what we're supposed to be doing, to ensure we differentiate ourselves clearly from some of the fake news that I think has bubbled up a lot more over the last couple of months.
Yeah, not really a big change, but just thinking about the people that are left out of the national dialogue because they don't have they don't have a computer, they don't have internet access, and we don't have as much of an ability to travel into a lot of the communities. So I guess we're just trying to think about making sure that we're reaching all those communities that we could before the pandemic, and trying to figure out how we can do that and keep serving the people who are not being heard.
I want to, just conscious of the time, I have a couple questions that I wanted to pose, just looking really to the future now, and what's your newsrooms. I mean, obviously none of you have a crystal ball, but do you think that they'll ever look like they did before the pandemic? Has this really reshaped everything, or do you foresee your operations getting back really to looking and operating as they did before?
I think the onus is on us to, you know, if we look at pre-pandemic as the good old days, and we look at today as the days we're living now, I think the onus is on us to invent what's next and take the best parts of the good old days and the best parts of what we've learned from the pandemic and carve out what the next chapter looks like. So if we look at some of the technology we've used, the working from home, there are some advantages to that. And I think the onus is on us to be deliberate handpick the best parts of pre and post pandemic, or pre and pandemic, to build out post pandemic realities for our newsrooms.
Yeah, I think that we're still gonna keep a little bit of a mix of allowing people to work from home, because at first, it seemed I guess everyone's distracted by the pandemic and the numbers going up, and you're trying to work at home and all of these distractions. And then after a while, after working from home for quite a while and then going into the office a couple of days a week, I found that, like, wow, I'm even more distracted, when I'm in the office and, talking to people and, when, watching the feeds come in and seeing the live production. And I found, wow, I'm way more productive when, if I could just stay at home and keep working. So definitely benefiting from experiencing both. And I think there will continue to be a better balance of work and home life. And maybe that will keep our workforce even younger, because we all know that's the kind of life, that we all hear about. Millennials, and I don't know if anyone is listening on this webinar here and can relate, because we talked about younger people wanting this life balance more, about working at home, and I don't know if this is part of what was in mind, but we'll definitely be keeping a bit of both worlds.
Yeah, I'd massively agree with that. This question is really funny for me because we, when you ask, will our newsroom kind of look the same, I think you said, we moved our newsroom in the middle of this. We were sold and we had to leave the place where we had been for years. So all our stuff is in boxes and we're kind of waiting for where we land. So that's exciting in a way, because we can build whatever that ends up being. But I do imagine it's going to be a hybrid of story meetings at work and way more at home, working from home for reporters in particular, I imagine. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to thank each of you for doing this, for giving the time to this, to the students and others who gathered here today. It's very much appreciated to get your insights. I think that often the media, being as it is, we get to know the reporters, we get to know the people on camera and writing the big stories, and we often don't get to see the people who are really actually keeping these things alive. And it's been nice to get to hear some of your perspectives today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
So I think the host will, if there's anything more that any of you would like to say, but otherwise, I think we're good to start parting.
Great. Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank
just
you.
maybe one last word. If anyone is interested, we'll be posting a VJ position in Thunder Bay very shortly. And that could be home-based and pretty much anywhere in Northern Ontario. Okay. That's my last plug. Okay.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.